everyone, and welcome back to Playlist Pages, or welcome if you're new here. So today we're doing part 2 of Beloved. Finally, last week we ended off with Denver closing an open match between her and Paul T by taking Beloved's side rather than Paul D's in an argument he was having with Sethi. Today we're continuing from chapter 6. Beloved could not take her eyes off Sethi. Sethi was licked, tasted, eaten by Beloved's eyes. She won't leave the room unless she has to. She looks for Sethi. She waits for her after work. She comes to meet her for every day closer and closer, and Sethi for her part feels pleased, the way a zealot pleases his teacher. Beloved suddenly wakes Sethi, and she asks her about her diamonds, and the storytelling delights Beloved, and it amazes Sethi as much as it pleased Beloved, because every mention of her past life hurt. Sethi doesn't even question how Beloved got knowledge of her diamonds. She just tells the story because for some reason Beloved unlocks that something in her. Beloved opens up those floodgates of emotions and the past, and she makes Sethi deal with her trauma. She makes it confront it head on. She got these earrings from Miss Garner because Sethi was upset about the fact that she didn't have a proper wedding, and she even made a wedding dress out of a fishing net, and she stole bits of fabric, and Miss Garner didn't mind that she did that, and she didn't say anything even though she had laughed at the idea of a wedding before. The idea that these slaves could be considered people, because that was how slave owners viewed it at the time, as something worse than people, no more than a money investment for labor on their farm. And so the fact that Miss Garner gave her crystal earrings, that was a sign of, I don't know, empathy from a woman's perspective, seeing that Sethi was just another woman after all? Or was it some sort of pity and white guilt, an attempt to reconcile herself with the fact that she was, like other white women, specifically a slave owner at the time? Sethi has a difficult relationship with Miss Garner. Miss Garner is nicer than some slave owners, but at the same time, can she really reconcile herself ethically with being a good person in a bad world if she does nothing against the bad world that she's living in? This is one of the key ethical questions that Toni Morrison poses to us as the reader. Is Miss Garner trying to be a nice person, or is she merely just better because the rest of her background is absolutely terrible? Next day, Sethi, Denver, and Beloved are at the river, and Sethi is brushing Denver's hair, and poor Denver's complaining because it hurts so much to have the comb run through her very tangled hair. And as she's complaining, suddenly Beloved speaks, and her gravelly voice makes them go quiet. They're surprised to hear that voice. They say that it has something of a song in it, and she asks Sethi whether her mother ever did her hair. But Sethi's mother never actually cared for Sethi. She was also a slave. That is perhaps why exactly Sethi didn't want Denver and Beloved to grow up with the life that she had, because her own mother fed her for 2 weeks before running off and continuing with her labor and continuing with her slavery duties and having other women feed her. Other women's breast milk fed Sethi. She grew up without her mother's comfort. The only thing that her mother told her was, I have a scar right here, use that scar to identify me when I'm dead. And in the end, her mother was hung, and she was so swollen that she was beyond recognition, and not even the scar that she had asked Sethi to look out for helped. And Sethi also thinks back to Nan, a woman who was friends, as much as you could be friends with another slave because you couldn't love someone too much, who was sort of friends with Sethi's mother because they came on a ship from Africa together. And she told Sethi how her mother was repeatedly assaulted by black men and white men alike on the ship from Africa to America, and she ended up having a lot of children, and she terminated every pregnancy but one, but Sethi, and she named Sethi after her black father. And so this is a reminder of the cruelty of the journey that the slaves faced to be imported into America for labor. When Sethi gets lost and thought, Denver hates it. That's why she only asks about Amy. The rest was a gleaming, powerful world, made more so by Denver's absence from it. She wished Beloved would hate it too, but she doesn't. She lives off of these stories. She feeds off of that energy. She's greedy, and she always asks really specific questions, and about the earrings and about the hair. And the obvious and eerie and discomforting question is, how did she know? Beloved was shining, and Paul D didn't like it. It says that she looks like a strawberry plant just before they shoot out their wines. She's positively shining, and he wants to pay attention, which is why he always has Sethi on waking. They sleep together so that his head is clear and he can face Beloved, and one day they're having dinner at the table he had broken the day he arrived at 1 to 4. Its mended legs are stronger than before. In other words, beloved is back and stronger than ever. She is that table that he threw to the side of the house and he tried to beat her out, but here she is, and now that table, its legs are mended and it stands firm, just as Beloved has firmly secured her place. He begins to interrogate Beloved about how she got here, and she merely replies that she told me. When I was at the bridge, she told me. In the old days, the house used to be a station for messengers to leave their messages. And he decides to ask how Beloved got here. And he doesn't want to push. And he knows that Sethi and Denver, they don't want him to push either. But still, he continues. And in the end, Beloved replies, she walked here a long, 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 long way. Nobody bring me. Nobody help me. And when he asks about her perfect clothes, Beloved shouts at him that she took the shoes and the dress and the shoestrings don't fix. And she looks at him malevolently, and Paul D feels like a large silver fish had slipped fork his hands the minute he grabbed hold of its tail. It's too late. Beloved has already influenced them. They feel nothing more but pity and kinship. A kinship that they don't yet realize to her. And he realizes that her shining is one of focus, but her behavior and lack of memories, it doesn't really make the characters realize that she's supernatural yet, for one simple reason. Her story mirrors that of countless of Black folks who suddenly found themselves without the capacity psychologically, without the capacity emotionally to deal with the horrors of what they have been through. And so before this has led to some critical theories in terms of thinking of Beloved not as a ghost, but as a case of double identity, double mistaken identity, where Beloved doesn't quite know who she is, but she has this vague recollection of some woman who had a baby called Beloved, so she thinks that she's Beloved, and Sethi, of course, thinks that it's her daughter reincarnated, and the reality is that they're both strangers to each other. But I don't think that's the case necessarily. I think this novel has those aspects of the supernatural specifically, and I do think that Beloved is genuinely a reincarnation, but I do want to stress that there are multiple interpretations of this novel, and this is my personal pet peeve when English teachers tell you, no, you're wrong, because you can't tell people that they're wrong if they have the quotes to back it up, if they have the evidence to back it up. So I think that you can believe whatever you want about Beloved. You can believe that she's a random woman. You can believe that she's an incarnation. But I think the more important question to focus here is not who Beloved is, or not what she is, rather. It's what she represents, and it's who she is to Sethi. It's who she is as a character and how she makes the characters around her feel that matters, well, to me at least. Paul D himself has known people so stunned or hungry or tired or bereft it was a wonder they recalled or said anything. I think he isn't so much as scared of Beloved as upset that she's getting into the relationship that he's starting to build with Sethi and Denver. He wants to focus on Sethi and the future, but Beloved wants to focus on her past. So in a way, they're both sides of Sethi warring together over what's the best way to confront trauma and to deal with it and to move on. And I mean, of course, it raises us back to that very question of how can we move on from trauma and how can we let it heal, or can it ever even heal completely? These are the questions that Toni Morrison is trying to raise. But the discussion is broken off because Beloved chokes on a raisin, very conveniently, must I add. And so Denver fusses over her and the two go off, and Sethi starts an argument with Paul D. Already their relationship is fraying at the edges, and suddenly Paul D snaps at her and he tells her that actually Hallie went insane because he saw the white boys take Sethi's milk. She's furious, but Paul D tells her that a man ain't a goddamn axe. Chopping, hacking, busting every goddamn minute of the day. Things get to him. Things he can't chop down because they're inside. Hallie was driven insane, and the last time he saw him, he was mute and covered with butter. Their pasts are all interconnected. It's not just her suffering, it's the suffering of them all. And again, Toni Morrison reminds us about the legacy of slavery and how interconnected they were, how this intergenerational trauma is passed on. But her brain was not interested in the future. Loaded with the past and hungry for more, it left her no room to imagine, let alone plan for the next day. The two of them think of the past, and Sethi asks how Paul D had a bit in his mouth and survived. A bit was a torture device they inflicted onto slaves, and he tells her he won't open up that can of worms, but the worst bit was going by a rooster, because he saw a rooster bathing in the sun, and that chicken was placed above his own position. They were dehumanized to that extent that this is what made him lose himself. He won't speak any more of it. He would keep the rest where it belonged, in that tobacco tin buried in his chest where a red heart used to be. Its lid rusted shut. He would not pry it loose now in front of the sweet, sturdy woman, for if she got a whiff of the contents it would shame him, and it would hurt her to know that there was no red heart bright as Mister's comb beating in him. He turns to the tobacco tin, which he keeps here, as as a symbol for dealing with his own traumatic past. And then Sethi goes to knead the dough, working dough. Nothing better than to start the day's serious work of beating back the past. Beloved and Denver are dancing, and for the first time, Denver sees her sister filled with gaiety. She had seen pleasure and warm satisfaction radiating from Beloved's skin when she listened to her mother talk about the old days. But not this joyful feeling. She joins in and the two dance until they're exhausted, and that's when Denver asks her, "Where were you before?" She replies, "It was dark, and I was small in that place." And she demonstrated how small she was by curling into a fetal position. She says it was hot, nothing to breathe down there and no room to move in. She tells her she came out to see Sethi's face, and she remembers being in the water and seeing Sethi's earrings right there, but when she reached out to touch them, she couldn't because she left me behind. And this, of course, refers back to Sethi. Notice how it's referring to what seems like an experience within the womb. That's what makes this novel so clever in many ways. It's how Toni Morrison presents us with this information. I firmly believe, or maybe it's my childhood side looking towards the supernatural, that Beloved is a reincarnation rather than a case of mistaken identity. I mean, listen to the description. Fetal position, hot, nothing to breathe, but look at it from the position of those who believe that it's a case of double mistaken identity. Slaves also had no room to breathe because they were thrown from one place to another, constantly facing death of people all around them. They couldn't, to the point where they couldn't even form human relationships and get attached because they were being so dehumanized. Likewise, they wanted to curl up into that fetal position because they felt small. This book has so many interpretations. It's laden with them, it's heavy with them, and I think that it really shows Toni Morrison's talent as a writer. And suddenly Denver realizes, I mean, she realized before, but this is it. This is her open confirmation, and she grabs Beloved's wrist and she says, "Don't let ma'am know who you are." Beloved gets angry, and she tells her not to order her around because she's the one I need. You can go, but she's the one I have to have. And Denver's hurt, and she says to Beloved, "But I didn't do anything to you. I didn't hurt you." And Beloved says, "Neither did I." And then she says, "Well, I will stay because I belong." And Denver says, "But I belong as well." And the two sit while their quietness boomed about on the walls like birds in panic. This interaction shows how difficult and emotionally charged the scene is between these two sisters, because how do you live on as a sister knowing that your other sister has been left behind? How do you not blame another child for what wasn't their fault, but how do you not feel jealousy that they get to live while you don't get to live? And I think that this is the sad irony that Sethi tried to protect Denver. We saw it in the first part about how she doesn't let Denver see any struggles. She's going to protect her like while she lives. "Until I die," she tells Paul D. And yet she puts this trauma onto her. Her grief is so big and all-consuming that it consumes Denver as well. It makes Denver part of the story, even though she doesn't necessarily want to be or have to be part of the story. Beloved asks her to talk about how Denver was born, and turns out that Amy was the one who delivered the birth. She rubbed Mam's feet back to life, and she cried, she said, from how it hurt. But it made her think that she could go over to where baby Suggs was. Like water, like cheese, feet are a recurring motive throughout this novel because technically they're the only thing that slaves owned. The only thing that they had. The only thing that distinguished them from animals or helped them get from one place to another. And Denver tells the story, as she tells it, she was seeing it now and feeling it through Beloved, feeling how it must have felt to her mother. It's a way to confront the trauma, and the two of them do their best to recreate it, and they voice it, and it turns into a duet, and suddenly the story moves to Sethi's voice because they went so close to her, emotionally. Amy had asked to see Sethi's back, and she gasped when she saw it covered with blood and open, and she said that it was like a choke cherry tree. She goes off to collect cobwebs, and she drapes them over Sethi's back, and they cool her down, they comfort her, and we realize that Amy was also a servant. And she was also beaten, but never to the extent that Sassy was, because she's not a black woman, she's a white woman. And Amy sings to her and massages her feet once more and tells her, "Don't up and die on me in that night, you hear?" She's rough and she's not at all gentle, but she understands and she tries to emphasize, or at least she tries to understand, because she sees firsthand how tough it is. And of course, she has those internal prejudices, and of course, she has that discrimination, but she genuinely tries to help her. Amy is perhaps the only white woman who has actually not been guilty of anything. She was not a slave owner, she was a slave herself, and now she's going to Boston. That's why she's here. She's there to make a life for herself, and she's there to help Sethi make a life for herself as well. And because of Amy's massages, the next day Sethi manages to get up and to walk a few steps, and she thinks to herself that the baby must be dead, but she realizes that it's more of a metaphorical death and that she must feed it milk, and suddenly Amy produces shoes made from Sethi's shawl and covers them with leaves, and they walk to the river, and suddenly it looked like home to her and to the baby, because as soon as Sethi got close to the river, her own water broke loose to join it. She goes into the river and there's a boat there, and suddenly she's in labor, and Amy pulls and Sethi pushes, and the two do their best. They wrap their baby in their clothes and rinse off the blood, and Amy tells her, "You better tell her, you hear? Same as Amy Denver of Boston." And Sethi goes to sleep with the thought of Denver being a pretty name. This chapter starts with, "It was time to lay it all down." Before, Paul D's words kept Sethi going, and baby Suggs massaging her neck and telling her to "Lay me down, Sethi, sword and shield. Down, down, both of them down. Down by the riverside, sword and shield, down, down, both of them down by the riverside, sword and shield, don't study war no more, lay all that mess down." We then see just what kind of role Baby Suggs played for the community before life broke down. She was holy, loved, cautioned, fed, chastised, and soothed. She had always made extra food and left the lamp on for strangers. She had left messages there, and it was to 124 that Sethi had been going, to this house 124 in Bluestone Road, and because Baby Suggs had decided that, because slave life had busted her legs, back, head, eyes, hands, kidneys, womb, and tongue, she had she had nothing left to make a living with but her heart. She had led sessions in the clearing. First she would pray, then she would let the children in, who would laugh, and then she would let the men in, who would cry, and then they all got mixed up and exhausted and riven. All and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. She told them that in this place where they dance, on bare feet in grass, they are flesh. They are truly people. You got to love it. She tells them, because the white people had whipped their hands, they had whipped their backs. They had not respected them. They had not loved their bodies, and only here in this clearing do they get to be truly alive. Do they get to truly feel like people. Not like slaves, not like something worse than animals, but as people, as flesh. Sethi puts on a shawl, and she tells Denver and Beloved to put on a shawl, and they go to this clearing because she wants to think. And she sits down on Baby Suggs' rock, and she reflects on how that day Amy had given her her underwear to put the baby in and left. And she had went to the river as best as she could, and there was an old man and a boy, colored men, luckily, as she refers to them, and she gets onto the boat, and they say, and the man takes off the boy's clothes, and he wraps the baby in it, and he says, "You want it back? Then go ahead and take off that baby. Put the baby naked in the grass and put your coat back in. And if you can do it, then go on way somewhere and don't come back." And it's moments like these that made me particularly emotional, that made me cry reading this book, because of course it's about the suffering, but it's also so much more than that. It's about the humanity. That's the truly heart-wrenching moment, to see that some people can still retain their humanity even in those desperate situations, to see the strength of the human spirit. And the man called Stampede, he leaves Sethi in the boat, and he goes, and soon a woman called Ella comes to help them, and she tells her that her children had made it, and the children Sethi had sent ahead, and Ella tells her, "Don't love nothing," when she looks at Denver, because of course the chances for that baby aren't great. And when she finds out that a white folk helped, she says, "Then we better make tracks," showing the widespread distrust even towards kindness. In chapter 10, Baby Suggs kisses her and refuses to let her see the children until Sethi looks better. Sethi sleeps, and she wakes up sometimes to see baby Suggs bathing her feet and washing her arms and cleaning her lower area and her feet. And she's also shocked when she sees Sethi's back, and so she puts this extra padding onto her back to cover her scars to absorb the blood. When Sethi wakes, she breastfeeds Denver, and luckily the milk is fine, and she plays with her other children, and they go to throw out the other clothes, but they see the diamond earrings, and she decides to keep them, and baby Suggs promises her that she'll pierce her ears later. They express their worry for Haley, but their certainty that Hugh managed to escape. Because Sethi did, didn't she? Pregnant, barely alive, with her open back, she had managed to make it. Cut to the present when Sethi sits on Baby Sug's rock and reflects on her experiences and thinks of those 28 days that she spent in freedom with other black folk in the house, trying to recover, trying to accept that she's a free woman now and that she made it and her children made it. And suddenly her recollection is broken because she's being choked. And she falls off the rock, and Denver and Beloved gather around her and they're panicked, and she tells them that it was probably baby Suggs. And suddenly they see her neck and they see that it has bruises on it. So this wasn't like a mental issue. This was a physical issue, very much so. And mental and psychological trauma can haunt you so much that it has very real physical impacts and consequences. Beloved begins to massage her neck, and Sethi allows herself to relax, and for a moment the three of them just sit in the clearing until she smells that Beloved's breath smells like milk, and she tells her, "You're too old for that." And on the way back, she realizes that the fingers choking her were the same fingers as that were in the house, doing all those terrible things. It was Beloved choking her, not baby Suggs. Baby Suggs would never do that because baby Suggs never harbored any harm or ill will towards her. Beloved the adult had saved Sethi from her childhood self because she is beginning to understand. She's imperfect, yes. She wanted to hurt her, yes. But she's also beginning to see what her mother had gone through, what had led her to make these decisions. And this experience makes Sethi realize that she wants Paul D in her life, and she rushes back to the house, and suddenly she sees Paul D sitting in a bathtub there. And he gets up and he's, of course, soaking wet, and he leans against her and he soaks her dress. And again, we see the significance of water. She allows it to absorb her. It stains her dress. And he asks her if maybe she'll fry up corn for dinner too. And she says yes. And she realizes that she had milk enough for all. She doesn't doubt the future anymore. And Beloved, realizing this, is furious because she hates Baldi. She hates that Sethi's spending time with anyone but her. She hates that Sethi's trying to build a new life and to move on. How can you move on, mother, when you have left me behind? That is her attitude towards it. And she runs off outside and she sees Denver near the stream, and Denver confronts her. And she says, "It was you who choked my mother, didn't you? You wanted to hurt her, but I thought you loved her." And Beloved ignores the question and she says, "I fixed it, didn't I?" She doesn't want to admit that her love is hurting Sethi, just like Sethi's love had hurt her. Then she leaves, angry at Denver too. And Denver's left to reflect on how, as a child, she had been taught and educated by a mixed woman called Lady Jones. And she was taught spelling and reading and writing, and she had excelled, but soon all the boys began to avoid her. And suddenly one boy directly came up to her and asked her about her mother. And that's when she realized. And the next day she decided that she couldn't go back to school anymore, and she went outright to her mother and asked her about it, and she couldn't hear the response. She lost hearing. It impacted her so much that her physical capabilities in life were diminished. This was a child thrown into the world which she was unable to handle. Until one day she heard thunder crawling up the stairs. She realizes it's the baby, and miraculously her hearing is back. From then, the presence was full of spite. The baby's no longer interested in mischief, and everyone begins to distance themselves until the spite became so personal it drove each off. That's when Denver realizes that she only has the baby, and between Sethi and Beloved the choice was without conflict. So she realizes that her hearing came back for the baby because this is her life purpose now. To understand, to deal with trauma that she can't see because it's her mother's. This is why she wants Beloved, and she realizes that Sethi has another life, but she, Denver, she doesn't have anyone. Denver had kept watch for the baby and withdrew from everything else until Paul D came, but the damage he did came undone with the miraculous resurrection of Beloved. Denver decides to not care whether or not Beloved had killed her mother. She approaches her standing by the river, eager for a word, a sign of forgiveness. She takes the choice between her mother's death and Beloved's guilt. She chooses Beloved. She finds Beloved watching two turtles mate. And then Beloved drops her skirt into the water and she allows herself to get soaked. And she's thinking about how the turtles are like Sethi and her precious mother is being torn away from her. We see that she's going to begin to formulate a plan on how to get Sethi back. And with that, let's end this video here and we'll continue next time from chapter 11 onwards. Thank you so much for watching and making it here. Don't forget to subscribe and put a like so that you don't miss any new videos. Thank you and I'll see you next week.